All right. Yeah. So this is the topic, as you've seen from the wonderful publicity that the Foundation carries out. And I hope that we can talk about some new developments and also maybe have some fun in thinking about some new possibilities. So I want to start by noting what probably many of you know, all of you perhaps. There are different ideas about what role computing should play in schools and in education more broadly. And then the occasion for this talk is that there's some things happening just now in artificial intelligence that I believe have implications for how we think about these big questions about the role of computing in the schools. And then I want especially to connect these ideas to the situation that you all face as teachers. So what does this mean to you, these developments? So we'll see how we can do with those things. So probably many of you are familiar with the concept of computational thinking. It's now more than 10 years old, and actually if you read on Wikipedia you'll find that it's even older than that, but for many people, including myself, the person who first really drew attention to this idea was Jeanette Wing, who's been a professor of computer science and official at our National Science Foundation and so on. And Wing was noting some tensions in the world of computer science education, that the society was becoming very excited by this idea, but Wing felt that the point was somehow being missed, that people thought, well, it's all about learning how to program. And Wing thought, no, it's not all about learning how to program. It's something bigger than that, more pervasive. And so I've given you one quotation from her: thinking like a computer scientist, this is the idea of computational thinking. Thinking like a computer scientist means more than being able to program a computer. It requires thinking at multiple levels of abstraction. And there's a lot more that she said, but this will maybe serve to anchor one side of a kind of a conversation. And some of you may be familiar with this project, Computer Science Unplugged. And this was a response in part to what Wing was saying. So Wing is saying, look, it's not all about programming. You don't even have to have a computer. You can teach computer science with no computer. And maybe some of you have used some of these activities. They're a lot of fun. So this is a view. But we can note that if we focus on this computer science without a computer thing, it doesn't create software. It maybe creates something else, but it doesn't create software. So if we're going to be using software in the classroom, and of course there are many reasons we might want to do that, the question arises, well, where's that software going to come from? And there's an answer. It's going to come from what I'm calling the market, and I mean that in a broad way. I don't mean just the commercial market, but out there, okay? So we're in our classroom. The software comes from out there. Somebody else creates it. And I've given an example, which I understand some of you made use of. It's quite a wonderful package called GeoGebra. And so I mean no criticism of GeoGebra whatsoever, but I just observed somebody else created that. Okay? And so if you were a teacher, you're dependent on someone creating that for you. Well, there's an older idea, actually, due to Andy DeSessa, a longtime professor of education at University of California, Berkeley. And Andy, for many years, and I can tell you down to this very moment, Andy is very concerned about the promotion of a different vision here. And this is a vision he calls computational literacy. And when he writes about this, he's careful to say, you know, sometimes people think about computer literacy. So this is sort of barely being able to turn on the computer or something. He's saying, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about computer literacy. I'm talking computational literacy. And by that, he means to refer explicitly with the core and original notion of literacy, as in real literacy, reading and writing, which we all agree is a profoundly transformative competence that society, at enormous cost, has developed over literally millennia. So this is a really big idea. But Andy is saying we should be thinking about computation that way. We shouldn't be thinking just it's using these computers, whatever. And it relates to some of what Ernesto was saying. These are big ideas. They're not minor ideas. And sadly, perhaps, Andy is not so good at the one-liner as Jeanette Wing, so I couldn't find just a single statement from him. If you're interested in this, I certainly hope you'll read some of what he's written about, but I did try to pick out something here. So you say, I define a literacy as the adoption by a broad cultural group, not an individual, certainly. Perhaps an entire civilization, again, he's thinking big, of a particular infrastructural representational form for supporting intellectual activities. And then what that doesn't say, but I'm telling you, for him, that form of representation is computer programs. So computer programs are going to be a way to create and express ideas, intellectual products. Well, perhaps you can get from that, in contrast to some interpretations of computational thinking, computational literacy means you got to be able to program. Just as to be literate, you got to be able to read and write. Not someone else is going to do that for you. You have to be able to do it. So this is different in the role that computation is going to play and what students have to know and do as part of that. And I'll just comment, this will be true throughout, that partly just for fun, many of the illustrations, maybe even all of them that I'll be sharing with you, were created by an artificial intelligence system. This happens to be one called Stable Diffusion. You provide a description. So in this case, I said, I want a picture of students using computer in a biology class. And it doesn't have a library of pictures in which it looks things up and found this one. It created this image itself from that description. Okay, back to Andy DeSessa. So Andy wanted personally to really advance this computational literacy agenda, and he recognized that the available computational tools were seriously deficient as the basis for doing this kind of thing. And we all know this. You know, computer technology is really complicated, and to master all kinds of trivial details, it's really hard to work with it for anybody, let alone try to use it as an integral part of your educational activities as a teacher of history, let's say. So Andy and colleagues, initially at MIT and then later at Berkeley, developed a system called Boxer. And unfortunately, time doesn't permit saying too much about this, but I'm showing you a screenshot, which maybe gives you a little flavor of it. So in the Boxer system, you can create graphical objects like those triangles, which of course you can make move and transform and so on, but perhaps you can also get a sense that you can have in a Boxer program a lot of text. So there's sort of a word processor that's incorporated in this, and all of this stuff is integrated. It's a very elegant system. Well, sadly, and unfortunately this is not unusual, the world was not kind to the Boxer system. So it became pretty widely used for a period in the 1990s, and then for complicated and kind of depressing reasons, it lost support. And until very recently, none of you would be able to use it, and actually I'm not up to the minute right now. If some of you are curious about it, actually I'm pretty confident I could help you get access to it. I don't think it's yet widely publicly available. But actually, Andy, working with other people, have now created a new version of Boxer which runs on modern computers and so on. So it's kind of coming back, and actually if any of you are interested in this idea, I'd love to hear from you, as would Andy, because he really wants to push this idea, and part of it is the Boxer system. Okay, well, just from what I've said, this means all of you as educators face a choice. Okay? So you can say, well, I really like the computational thinking idea. I don't want to spend a lot of time having my kids learn to program. I think they can get the benefit of this somehow without doing that. Or maybe you think, no, I like the computational literacy idea. Well, I've tried to bring out here just some of the consequences of making one choice or the other. And actually, I'll comment that, at least in the US, the choice really has been made that it's the first one, computational thinking. Well, what are the consequences? Well, we've already talked about one. The only programs that are available are ones that are provided by the market. Okay? And what that in turn means that what students and teachers can explore in the classroom is limited to the extent that they feel they want their exploration to be supported by software. It's limited because either what they want to explore. Someone in the market has thought it was worth providing some support for that, in which case maybe that's okay. But if they went in a little direction, a different direction, and they wanted to think about something else, perhaps they find there's no support for that. But also, to the extent that activities are supported by software, in general, it is incompatible software between one tool and another. So take GeoGebra. So let's say your students, and it's a very flexible tool, your students invest in learning that. Well, then they go into another class, and there's some other software tool that they're asked to learn, and it's different, and they have to invest in learning both of them. This is wasteful, you can argue. For me, the most important issue is the second one there. I believe strongly that it's very important for students and teachers to be able to choose their own paths of exploration. Okay, well, on the other hand, if you go with computational literacy and somehow let's imagine that you have something like the Boxer system, well, now the students and the teachers can create the programs that they want, but there's a price tag. The students and the teachers have to invest time learning how to program. And even though Boxer was designed to be relatively easy to learn, it's still not trivial, I can assure you. So this is a cost. So this is a choice that we've faced up to now. But we are here because there's a new possibility. What if you could create programs? You could say, I want a program to do this, but you didn't have to know how to program. This may seem like a ridiculous idea, but I assure you it's not. Okay? So this is actually something, the concept in the computer science world is called automatic programming, and it's a very old idea, but you can find publications about it which say explicitly, this is a ridiculous fantasy. And until very recently, it was exactly that. But now it's not, as I hope to show you. So there's a technology which goes by the not very informative label large language models, and later on I'll try to explain to you why that name makes some sense, but for now you can just treat it as a name. So as I'll be showing you here, this technology allows you to write programs without knowing anything about how to program. Sound interesting? Okay. All right, so here's an example. So suppose you're a math teacher and the subject comes up of large numbers or something, and you think, well, it would be good if the kids could easily explore what happens when you flip various numbers of coins. Okay, so if you flip a small number of coins, the chance that all of them are, let's say, heads is relatively large, but if you have a larger number of coins, it's never going to happen that they're all going to be heads, say. Suppose that's a point you want to make. Okay, so it's tedious working with actual coins. So you don't want to have to do that. So you go online, and here I need to ask the tech people if you can click on that link. Okay, so this happens to be something you might find. So how about change flip 2 to flip 5, let's say, if you see the dialog or that thing there, okay? And then if you do the drop down for coin type, let's see what we have there. Okay, I think, actually go down, how about Brazilian real, which is near the bottom of the screen there. I think they have a Honduran coin on. There are no Costa Rican coins on the list. Okay, yeah, that's good. Okay, and then press the flip coins button. There you are. Okay? All right, so there's some good news there. Actually, if we can go back to the slides. You know, it's kind of nice. I mean, someone did a lot of work to get images of all those coins and whatnot. Whoops, yeah. Yeah, staying on this one, good. So that's okay, but, you know, you notice it just flips them. It doesn't say this many were heads or anything like that. So we might say, well, you know, we want to do more than that. Okay, so we're going to use a tool called Codex, which is one of these large language model-based systems. And I'm going to type in what's on the screen, and I'll tell you in a minute what that's all about. But the part I want you to focus on, actually, and I'm highlighted on this slide, which is the same stuff, but I've just put in red the part to really pay attention to here. So I'm saying I want to show a random string of H's and heads and H's and T's, which stands for heads and tails. Apologies if that doesn't translate well. So this is a start. Okay, I want to see, can it do this? So I type this in, and the other stuff we'll talk about later. For now, you can sort of ignore it. Okay, so I type this in, and if you can click the link on there. Whoops. Uh-oh. All right, you're going to have to trust me. I'm going to tell you what would have happened had we been able to click that link. Let me just time out here, and much appreciation to the technical people here. We know how hard they work on these things, but also it's miraculous we can do this at all. So I'm glad to be here and able to talk with you about this. Okay, so if we were to click on this, you would get a not very interesting web page, but what it has on it is a random string of 10 H's and T's. So it did what I said. It gave me that web page. Okay, and just a little comment here. The other stuff I have to type in, except for what I showed you in red. Whoops. Oh, so I wanted to go back. The part in red is all I really have to care about. The rest of the stuff is always the same. And with little work, you could write a software tool that would just provide that, and you would just type in what was in red. Okay, so you don't really need to pay attention. Later I'll tell you what that stuff is doing, but it's really unnecessary to understand what's going on. Okay, so but then I might say, well, okay, that nice website with different coins allowed me not to just have 10 coins, but I could have 20 coins. Well, you have to trust me. If I type this in, so the only difference is I say now show a random string of 20 H's and T's. If we did this, we would get the web page, trust me, it shows 20 H's and T's, so it really works. But then you could say, well, this is kind of tedious. I don't want to have to type in a different number and all this stuff each time. What I'd really like to be able to do is let me type in a number and then show a random string of that many H's and T's. That's what I want. Trust me, if you type this in, you would get a web page that is exactly that. So there's a little box, and you can type a number in it, and there's a button you press, and it shows you that many H's and T's. It just works, okay? Well, and then you're thinking, well, okay, but before I was complaining that that coin flipping thing didn't tell me what proportion of H's and T's there were. So I make the same request, let me type in a number, show a random string of that many H's and T's, also show the proportion of heads. I put that in, trust me, I get a web page that's like what we had before, but now it shows the proportion of heads, okay? Furthermore, even though I didn't ask for this, it has a button on it that says flip, and if I flip again, it'll give me another random collection of however many I said to have, and it'll show me what the proportion there is. Well, oh, sorry, I got ahead of my story. You were wrong to trust me. That didn't work, actually. So I put in a perfectly sensible request, and this is too bad I couldn't show you the real web page because it would have kept me honest. But it would turn out it didn't actually, even though I asked for it very clearly, I asked it to show the proportion, it actually didn't in fact do that. It just showed the number of heads. Furthermore, on this one, if you flipped it again, the first time up, the number was correct. But if you then asked it to flip again, the number of heads was no longer correct. It gave you like a cumulative number of heads or something ridiculous like that. Okay. So a lesson here. This doesn't always work. Okay? But it's often productive, and in this case it is. So okay, here you can try to trust me again. I try again with the very same request. I don't change anything. I just say, try again. And if I did that, I get something that actually works the way it should have the first time. So what's happening is that in the way one would commonly use this tool, its behavior is somewhat random. And the good news about that, which is illustrated here, is if you ask for something and you get something that isn't quite what you want, sometimes you can just say, okay, try again, same request, and you get something that works. Okay, now you might be thinking, well, still there's a lot of work that maybe the program should do. I mean, I suppose we could make a table of different proportions of heads or something like that, but why can't the computer make a graph for me? So I elaborate my request. So let me type in a number, show a random string of that many H's and T's, show the proportion of H's. Do this for 5, 50, and 500 coins and draw a graph of the results. This doesn't work. Okay, I wasn't even preparing to show you an example of what it does. It just doesn't work. Okay? And what's happening here is this is actually asking codecs for a little bit too much. And this, what I mean by that will become clear, I hope, as we go through this. But we can make it work if we help out codecs. So if instead of asking for everything we want all at once, we're going to ask for part of what we want, like just the H's and T's, and then we add the request for the proportions, and then step by step we build up until we get what we really want. And that does work. And this I really wish I could show you, because trust me, this shows a page and it has a graph on it. Okay, and furthermore, it has the proportion of heads for 5 coins, 50 coins, and 500 coins, and it shows a graph. And you can flip it, and what you see is that the value for 500 coins, the proportion doesn't fluctuate very much, whereas the proportion for 5 coins fluctuates quite a bit, which is perhaps the lesson you want to draw from all of this. So you get a program that does this, it draws the graph, and you didn't have to know anything about programming to do it. Well, what did you have to do? So let me show you a little bit more of how this works. So there's a picture here of stepping stones. So the way this works is this. So we begin, and I'm showing you just the red stuff. So the stuff in black that we haven't talked about, that's still there, but that's just standard. It's not anything you have to understand. Okay, but the red part is that let me type in a number, show a random string of that many H's and T's, and show the proportion of H's. As we've seen, on the second attempt, we got it so that it did that. So the trick is this. I'm going to collect the program that it generated for that request. And for my next request, I'm going to give it my original request, what I asked for, and I'm going to give it back the code that it wrote for me that I liked. Okay? And then I'm going to add to that, this is all my second request, I'm going to add to that, write a program that takes a number, makes a random string, it gives the proportion, use that to show the proportions for 5, 50, and 500, which is part, but not all, of what I wanted. Okay? So I'm reminding it, so to speak, here's what I asked for first, here's what you gave me that I really liked, now here's what I want. And you might be wondering, what on earth is going on here? And we'll talk more about how this actually works, but I'll just note for now, what's happening there is that it's able, in creating its response to the added part of the request, it's able to, in effect, copy and adapt the earlier solution. So instead of having to come up with it all at once, and say, oh, I sort of see how, I mean, I'm anthropomorphizing wildly here, but the effect is, oh, I see, I can adapt this. This is more or less what I want. I just have to change it a little bit, and it does that. Okay, so now I get the code for that. Now I give all that stuff in again, together with the new code that it just generated for me, and I ask for more. So in addition to whatever I asked for, I say, make a table of the results. Notice not a graph yet. Make a table. And then when that works, for the final crescendo here, well, no, I guess there's 2 more steps. I'm going to put all those earlier steps in, including the solutions at each stage, and the code that it gave me for the last version of the request, and I asked for a little more. All of that, but draw a line graph of the numbers in the table. So one of the things that's going on here, it couldn't get all the way from just the numbers to the line graph. It couldn't quite do that. But it was able to get from the numbers to a table, and then from a table to the graph. Okay? And then finally, I won't go through the whole rigmarole here. Okay. So that actually worked, but because you didn't have the table, you couldn't actually see what the proportions were. You could see the graph, but you'd have to read it out. So then I said, well, okay, that's fine, but do all of that, but also display the table and the line graph, and that finally gave the finished product. Okay? So it did work. And I'll just comment here, if you read through all of that, there's no programming knowledge involved. You have to understand your problem, And you have to understand how to break it down, and you need to be patient. But think of all the things I didn't have to know how to do. I didn't have to know how to create a web page. I didn't have to know how to make a button on a web page. I didn't know how to connect a button to a particular action on a web page. None of that. Okay, truth in advertising. You saw this before. Remember the first time we asked for the proportion, it didn't work, and we had to ask it again? I had to do that, I don't remember whether every time, but many of these times I had to ask it to try again. So it's a tedious process. We'll say more about that later. But as you see here, it does work, and you don't have to know any programming to make it work. Okay, how does it work? So here's a look behind the scenes. So what Codex is what's called a neural network. And for our purposes, you can just consider a neural network to be an extremely large collection of numbers, which are called weights. And by large, I mean like 10 billion or something like that, okay? And they are arranged to do the following thing. So you can submit to this network a sequence of 1,000 words, and you can ask the network, guess what the next word would be. I'll come back and explain a little more about it. And it's going to make a guess. Initially, it has no clue whatsoever. The guess is going to be entirely random. But the beauty of neural networks is, it said it guessed broccoli, and you say, no, it's not broccoli, you should have guessed eggplant. And there's a structured process for revising those billions of numbers to get it so that the next guess will be just a tiny bit better, just a tiny bit better, okay? So how is that process used? So to create these large language models, you start with what's called a corpus. This is just a collection of input materials. And in this case, for Codex, it's a very large volume of English language text and a very large volume of program code, okay? And the training process goes like this, referring to the picture. We go into this huge amount of stuff, and we pick a random point, and we read out 1,000 words from there in order, okay? And we make a note, what's the 1,001st word? And then we do that process that I described. We give it the 1,000 words. We say, guess what the next one is? We say, no, here's the right answer, correct yourself. And we do that a bajillion times. So what's a bajillion? Well, they don't actually publish how many of those cycles was involved, but they do describe how much computational work was involved. So in terms of floating point operations, which some of you will know is a sort of common measure of sort of computing effort. This process took 10 to the 21st power floating point operations, and some of you will recognize that 10 to 21st power is just 2 orders of magnitude smaller than Avogadro's number. And we can all agree that Avogadro's number is a really big number. So this is a lot of computational power. But the remarkable thing is, when you do that, you get a system that now can be used. So first of all, during training, it gets so that it's pretty good at predicting what the next word is. Okay? You might say, well, who cares about that? Well, here's why we care. Whoops. Sorry, I was holding the controller upside down. Okay. So same model there, but now we're going to use it in a different way. So now we're finished training. Okay, we're happy. We've put in our almost Avogadro's number of prediction attempts, and it's tuned itself, and now we're ready to go. So now, we're not going to give it 1,000 words from the training. We're going to give it up to 1,000 words. Doesn't have to be full 1,000 words. We give up to 1,000 words of what we're interested in. And in general, that will be nowhere in this corpus, large though it was. So for example, what we asked for, give me a random string of H's and T's, that's probably nowhere in the corpus. It's just something we thought up. So we stick that in, we stick that request in for the top, and the system is just going to do what it always does. And as I've expressed there, it's a funny thing to think about, but it's as if the system is asking itself, if these words had appeared in my corpus, what would have come next? It's all counterfactual. It didn't occur there, but what if it had? Well, it's going to make a guess. Okay? So it guesses, but each time it's only going to guess the next word. So what's shown by some of the other arrows there is what we do with that. So it says, well, I think the first word in my response is whatever it is, and then it tacks, and it does this itself, it tacks that onto the end of our request, okay, and it says, all right, if I gave you what we asked for plus this first word, what would come after that? And then it generates another word, and then it sticks that onto the request, and what would come after that? So in that way, you can see that you could generate as many words that it thinks would follow what you asked for as you want. So the way this is commonly done is you put a limit on there, you say, okay, I only want 200 words or whatever. There's other things you can do, but that's what it was doing. Okay, so we're going to talk more about what this means, but I'm seeing some reflective expressions. Would anyone have a question about the story so far?
Machine learning.
Huh?
Machine learning in a basic process.
So machine learning, you want?
It's the
You're commenting, okay. Yes, this is an instance of machine learning, that's right. So this process of learning to make a prediction by attempting to make a prediction and being corrected over and over and over again, and that in a way we're not describing, there's a structured process for adjusting the weights so that this all works. So that over time, very gradually, it gets to be better and better at predicting. Okay, but you might be thinking, who cares about this? Well, here's why we care. You might say, well, why do I care what comes after something I asked for? So here's an effort to explain that. So I mentioned that the body of stuff this thing is trained on has a very large number of actual programs in it. And actual programs very commonly include little constructs called comments. And I've given you an example of an HTML comment, okay? Now, it's a fact, it's an empirical fact, that if you look at a whole lot of programs and you find a comment, what comes after the comment is generally code that does what the comment says. Not always, but often it is. Often enough that explains what you saw. We put in comments. The red stuff was in a comment, and the black stuff was mostly marking it as a comment. Okay? And so what that's inviting the model to do is, well, if this comment had appeared in the corpus, what do you think would have come next? And the model generates the code that implements that comment. Okay? So, in particular, this was what we started with. The first part is the comment marker that tells that it's a comment. The next part is a little technical. This thing, quote, knows, unquote, many different programming languages, and even a given programming language can be used in many different ways. And I'll just tell you, as I learned the hardware, if you don't put that statement pure JavaScript in there, what you're likely to get is a web program that assumes you have some library available to you because the other people that did the kind of thing you're asking for, nobody did exactly what you asked for, but when people did things similar to what you're asking for, they usually used, for example, the PHP library. Well, we don't want that. And by saying pure JavaScript, and again, you don't have to understand this, you just have to know superficially, I want to remember to say that. Otherwise, I won't be happy. But that's what that means. Then we put in the actual substance of the comment. Then there's a delimiter that says this is the end of the comment. And then that thing at the bottom basically says, what I want is a web page, because that's what web pages start with. Okay? So when it passes this input through the process we described, and it asks itself, if this had been in the corpus, what would have come next? What would have come next is the code for a web page, and we live happily ever after, as you saw, if you believe me. Okay, some practical stuff. I'm not going to go through all of this. You have access to all of this. So first thing, any of you can do this. including from a phone. So at least last time I checked, you probably won't be able to get immediate access. You have to go on a waiting list, but you should clear that waiting list. I've been talking about this with people, and they in general are able to get in. And then you might wonder about the economics of it. There is some money involved, but it's not very much money. In fact, there's no money involved for an initial trial period. So any of you could try this and with no financial exposure. I was kind of worried when I signed up for this, but I was reassured that they had some sort of limit. You know, we won't ever charge you more than such and such without letting you know when you're doing that. And I'm thinking, oh, what am I getting myself in for? I've been doing this a lot. And the largest bill I've ever gotten for a month's usage was $2.31. Okay, so it's not a lot of money. I appreciate that $2.31 is not no money, but again, you can use this. There's a free period that would be enough for you to kind of get a feel for what's happening here. And I'll skip over some things about my workflow. I already mentioned the pure JavaScript and some other tools. Okay, and here's a note that actually I'd be curious if some of you do try this out. I tried just a little bit to see if it would accept a comment written in Spanish, and the answer was that it did. Okay? So how much Spanish it knows, I can't tell you, but this would be a fun thing for you or your students to explore. But also there's another avenue. If you're not happy with the ability of Codex to understand Spanish, what you could do is to write your request or your student's request in Spanish, use Google Translate to translate them in English, and then submit them in that way to Codex. You could do that. But you may not have to. It may be fine with Spanish. Okay. So, back to the bigger questions that we're talking about here. So, again, if you trust me, you'll believe that Codex is able to take a natural language description written without any knowledge of how programming is done, and it can generate a complete web page that will do what you want. And so this takes us back to the assertion. So we haven't had this choice before, but now as teachers we say, well, I really want to be able to get programs to do the things that we want to do in my math class, but now you have a choice. You can have that happen without either you or your students knowing how to program in simple cases. Okay, so boy, you're going to really have to trust me on this. So I've made this point. This says that we could maybe get some of the benefits of computational literacy, not just computational thinking, but computational literacy without the investment in learning how to program. And I'll just have to describe to you a more complex example. So this was based actually on a program that was created using that Boxer system that I talked about as being used in the 90s, and this was a real thing that was done in a math class. So they were interested not in the statistics of flipping coins, but it nevertheless involves coins. So imagine that you have a grid, a 3x3 grid of 9 coins, and they're all either heads or tails, of course. And then for each row in the grid you have a button, and for each column in the grid you have a button, and for each diagonal of the grid you have a button. And when you press a button, all the coins controlled by that button are flipped. So if you press this diagonal button, then the 3 coins on the diagonal will all flip from whatever they are to the other side. And if you press one of the column buttons, those will flip. And the teacher who developed this was interested in questions like, if you have these operations available to you, and you have a particular configuration of heads and tails, let's say all heads, can you use those controls to create a given other configuration, such as all heads but one tail in the middle? Can you do that? And this gets into things in group theory. So how do these operations compose? What are the legal operations? What's the orbit of a particular configuration when you apply all the possible operations and the like? Again, trust me, I was able, using the step-by-step process that you saw, to create a pretty nice program that actually did that, and all the buttons work and all that. I'll just comment. I may be talking with you as if this all seems pretty familiar or whatever to me. I can tell you, I was amazed when I was working my way through this. And in particular, here's one thing that was amazing to me. So I was working step by step. So I got the grid of coins. I got the buttons for the rows. I got the buttons from the columns. And then I'm thinking, how's this diagonal thing going to work? okay? And I was particularly worried about, let's call the other diagonal. So on one diagonal, the row and column indices are the same, okay? What defines the indices on the other thing? This is going through my head. I'm thinking, how would I say that? Now, I'm a programmer. I knew I could say it, okay? But it wasn't trivial. And I'm thinking, how's this going to work? And I didn't expect it would work. So first I say, okay, give me a button for the diagonal. And it gave me a button for the diagonal. And then I said, give me a button for the other diagonal. And it gave me a button for the other diagonal. Not to worry. It worked out. Whatever it is that defines the other diagonal, it just worked it out. It just worked. Okay? So this is an illustration of what this can do, better or for worse. So as I'm saying here, as usual, when a question emerges, sort of other questions are sort of in the background, which maybe before we didn't have to think about. But now we really do have to think about it. So well, okay, now that this possibility presents itself, it forces us to really focus on something which we could ignore before. Before we could say, well, there's lots of reasons to know how to program. You might want to create programs, for instance. Now we have to ask ourselves, suppose you didn't have to use it to create programs. Suppose you could get all the programs you want, okay? Is there still value in knowing how to program? Is there value intellectually in it, separate from just getting the product? We never had to think about that before, but now we do. And of course, this is a question for you. So this is one of the first implications for a teacher. So what do you think about this? So when you think about computing, if you put aside its utilitarian value, does it have intellectual value that survives? And I'll just note something I haven't mentioned up to now, but maybe has been on the minds of many of you. And this is something that figures in the computational thinking and computational literacy discussion. There's a vocational value of programming for some students. Some of your students, like some of you, will go on and become software engineers or something like that, okay? Well, they need to know how to program, at least for now, okay? But let's in general, certainly in our schools, it's a very small proportion of the students, so it doesn't justify teaching everybody how to code for vocational reasons. But the question remains, are there intellectual reasons why people should know how to code? Second implication relating to that vocational observation. So actually, my son is a computer scientist who works on this stuff, not exactly this, but this kind of thing. And already, I think it was 3 years ago, he said, "Dad, there's no future in being a programmer." And I thought he was nuts. But as usual, he wasn't, okay? So it's not that there's going to be no need to be a programmer, but I do believe it's not at all a stretch to say that at a minimum what it means to be a programmer is going to be different in ways that will have implications for many of your students. Okay? So it's been the case, and probably you've all observed this, and maybe like me, you've kind of resented it. A person who loved the trivial details of programming and loved knowing all the odds, ins, and outs and all that stuff, they were really valuable. Somebody had to know all that stupid stuff this is me speaking, okay? Not anymore. These systems are way better at knowing the stupid stuff than any person is. People are still needed to understand the big stuff, and in particular, understanding users and their needs. So this is not just burying yourself with the bits and the bytes. This is learning how to talk to people, to understand what they're trying to do, to help them to understand how computational tools can help with that. This is big stuff. And maybe we all know people in the software world where they just don't think that's their job. Okay, just tell me what you want, I'll just do the bits and the bytes for you. That's not going to, we won't be needing people to do that anymore. Where are we here? Yeah, okay. Okay, so one more thing directed specifically at teachers. So, and maybe you can tell, I hope, from some of the things that I've said about how you have to try again and all this kind of thing. this is not, so to speak, a production tool. You don't want to say, okay, class, today we're doing group theory, and we're going to start by spending 5 minutes and creating a slick thing for flipping grids of coins. It's not like that. Someday it probably will be, but now it's not. So you're likely to find it frustrating if you try it out. But I hope that many of you will feel, well, this is something, nevertheless, that I want to work with my students. So if you have students that have learned some programming, they can speed up this whole process. Instead of just saying, you know, looking at the thing where it didn't present the proportions and say, all right, try again from the beginning, once more, see if you can do it. Instead you say, oh, I see, this is where it calculated the total, the count, instead of the proportion. I'll just change that. And then you have a working program. Other students will find it interesting just to understand how this kind of thing works, because I think this is a piece of the future that your students can access. And I'll just mention, the class of large language models has other things in it, as many of you may know. And in particular, there's a tool called GPT-3. So you remember the picture we had of how Codex works with the model and the predictions and all that stuff. GPT-3 is exactly the same, except it's not trained on code. It's trained only on a huge quantity of text. Actually, I can quantify huge for you here in a way that I didn't for Codex. So a huge quantity of text means all of Wikipedia in English is 3% of the text that the system is trained on. The corpus also includes the full text of 250,000 books. It's a lot of text. Okay, so it's trained that way. And what's the result? Well, I've got GPT-3, and any of you, actually GPT-3, you don't even have a waiting list. So I type in, how should teachers use Codex in the classroom? And inside, scare quotes, so to speak, inside the thing, it's saying, well, if this had been in the corpus, what would come next? Answer. There's no one answer to this question, as it will depend on the specific classroom and what the teacher wants to use Codex for. Some possible ways to use Codex Classroom include using it as a resource for lessons, using it to create assignments or projects, or using it to supplement other materials. Hard to argue with that. If you think about it another beat, this is kind of bland. This is kind of a safe answer. You can say this even if you don't really know what you're talking about, and that's what GPT-3 is like. I encourage you to work with it. Okay, I appreciate that we're coming near the end of the time here, so I want to add, with some encouragement from some of your colleagues, I want to add a few more remarks, and this specifically has to do with where we are in more than one sense. So you might feel, given what we've just talked about, and where I've said, oh, we won't need programmers anymore, or you might be impressed that, well, Codex really understands a lot. I mean, GPT-3 really understands about education or what have you. You might be thinking, you know, are we on the way to replacing ourselves? And Ernie talked about this possibility. And this is a serious possibility. I would say myself that it's not so much a possibility created by these technical developments, though they play a role. It's created by our own attitudes. So whenever we say, I don't want to have to use my judgment to evaluate the student's work, I want to have a rubric that defines exactly how I will evaluate this student's work, we are replacing ourselves. Not with a technology in this case, but by a formal structure. It's outside us. We're saying, I don't want to use my judgment. I want things to happen on some other basis. And I'm very worried because there are many indications of our going in that direction. So there are human values at stake here, very fundamental ones. What does it mean to be a human? And I think we can all agree, to be a human means to take responsibility, to be able to make judgments, and all of that. These are very important human values. Education is a very important human value that motivates everyone in this room, but I want to add sort of a special further to these three dots, and as I mentioned, it has to do with where we are. So we're in Costa Rica. You might say, really? Yes, we're in Costa Rica. Why am I telling you that? Costa Rica is, and always has been for as long as I've known, a very special place. It's a small country, but it's different from other countries. It's not the same as other countries. And one of the ways in which it's different is its commitment to human values, its commitment to democracy, its commitment to peace, its commitment to human health and well-being, and its commitment to education. So as things happen in the world, of the kind we're talking about here, but also the grinding of the mills of capitalism or whatever you want to point to, as things happen that call those human values into question, you in Costa Rica have a special opportunity and a special responsibility to defend those values and to enact them, as I know all of you do. So, it's all over but the thank yous. So of course I want to thank, again, the people who introduced me, the foundation, to various people that helped me to understand all this material and talk with me about it, and to all of you for your kind attention. So thank you, and I apologize, we're running a little late, but